Welcome to this week's edition of the Museum Roadshow. I'm Roger Engstrom, and we're going to talk a little bit about spring planting on the farms in Becker County, centering pretty much on small grains. I well remember as a small boy, my brother and I, we always got excited about getting started in the field in the spring. And our dad would kind of dampen the spirits a little bit. He says, well, you guys can't get all excited about starting in the field yet. The ice hasn't gone off Rochard Lake. Rochard Lake was a small lake near our farm, and when the ice went off, it seemed like things just went better to be around in the field. And for years, I've kept track of the ice on off dates of the lakes around here. In Detroit Lake, we've got records going back to 1893. There's only been 3 times in March that the ice has gone off the lake. The earliest was March 23rd in 1910. The other times ice went off the lake was 1902 in March, and 1910 and 1945. The average for ice out date on Detroit Lakes has always been around April 20th. Some of the fishermen around this area will remember May 17th, 1950. That's when the ice went off the lake. That year it was an extremely late spring. And in recent years, 2008 and 1996, we've also seen the ice go off the lake the very early part of May, and you kind of wondered if the ice would be off the lake in time for fishing, or we'd have to get out the fish house or break the ice with the oars. Early preparation for spring planting, of course, centered around rock picking and cleaning seed. A lot of farmers had their own little fanning mill. They would dump the grain in there, and it would run through this fanning mill and blow out the chaff and the rough material. It would also separate out the weed seeds, and hopefully the wheat or barley that you were going to plant would come out the back clean enough to plant. It was necessary to do this because you didn't want to plant weeds, and if you had coarse material in the seed, it would have a tendency to plug up the mechanism on the drill. And a big thing with the planting seed was to get the wild oats out. And this was quite a problem because wild oats would always get in the grain. It matured earlier and stayed with it. And they also had seed in the soil, so if you had fields that were clean, you didn't want to introduce this wild oat crop in there. And as time went on, they had a couple of chemicals that were good on wild oats, Fargo and Carbine, but they were hard to use because you had to get it timed just right to spray at the right time. And also they had a special fanning mill that would either have a special cloth or a screen in it to take out the wild oats, and it had limited success with that. The seed was pretty much handled in sacks prior to 1950. We have a picture here of Wesley and Ann Slaughterhoff holding up a grain sack. It's got the initials HCS on it. That was the initials for Henry Slaughterhoff. That was his sacks. And farmers did that because they had to keep their sacks separate as they were seeding and stuff in the spring. They'd share things back and forth at harvest time. They'd bring their sacks together and they'd all thrash together and use their sacks. That's how they kept them identified. Prior to 1950, most of the seed was handled in sacks. After that, they started handling it in bulk. A sack like Henry and like Wesley and Ann are holding would hold 120 pounds of wheat. And there was enough wheat in that sack to plant an acre, and an acre is about the size of a football field. And after the crop had grown through the summer, you were hoping you could come back and harvest a crop of wheat that you'd probably get from 8 to 12 sacks back from that one sack you planted on the football field. Of course, in the early times, the horses were used to work the fields. I talked to one guy, he said it was always nice to be out there with the horses. It was just like you were being in part of nature. You could hear the jingle of the harness, the squeak of the drill, and the soil sifting between the discs on the drill. And the frogs were probably croaking, and it was just like kind of being out there in a big music box. The grain drill made a small, shallow furrow in the soil, and the seed would come down from the seed box and drop into this little furrow that was made. There was a cover chain behind the disc that would kind of do somewhat of a job of covering the seed. It was rather limited, so they generally go over the field again with a harrow afterwards to kind of seal up the soil and help hold in the moisture and cover the seed a little better. Before they planted the field, they would go over it with a field cultivator. The field cultivator would loosen up the ground and help it dry out a little bit because you didn't want the soil sticking to the discs of the drill when you were planting. And the soil had to be dry enough so that it would fall back in and cover the seed. And it was always interesting if you were around an old grain drill to lift the cover and see what was written on the inside the cover, because that's where some farmers kept their records. They would write down the date on the cover that they started seeding, and of course If the drill had been around before 1950, that was always a late date on that drill box cover. Occasionally when we were seeding or doing field work in the spring, we'd see some killdeer out there in the field, and it was always interesting if you got close to a killdeer nest. The mother would leave the nest and she'd act like she had a broken wing or a bum leg, usually a broken wing. She'd be making a lot of noise as she scurried away from the nest, trying to get your attention. Well, we saw that. We knew that we better watch out here now. There's a killdeer nest around. We don't want to destroy it. So we'd stop what we were doing and just kind of look around, step carefully, and we'd usually find the nest. And then we'd make an effort to drive around it so we didn't destroy it. We never marked the nest, because if you did that, that was a sure sign that some predator would be along to destroy the nest. So we'd come back in a few days. Probably the chicks had already been hatched and they were running around or had left the nest completely. When tractors came on the scene for farming and the horses were getting replaced, the press drill also became part of the seeding system. The press drill was a little bit fancier drill. It did a little bit better job of covering the seed in the soil, and the press drills were used for a number of years. One thing bad about the press drill is if conditions were wet, the soil had a tendency to stick to the press wheels, and pretty soon you could have yourself a real mess if you got near a low spot and you made this press wheel look like a big roller. Then air seeders came on the scene within the last 20 years or so, and they've had some numerous challenges along the way, but now they've got the depth control figured down on that pretty good, and how to cover the seed. You're covering 40 feet in a pass, and you can seed about 100 acres or more before you have to stop and fill the drill. And when it comes time to move to another field, you just pull the hydraulic lever and the drill folds up and down the road you go. Well, thanks for watching this segment of the Museum Roadshow. Remember, on TV3, history repeats itself every 4 hours.